All right, like I said, we're going to be talking about movement and slicing the pie. As people join in, everybody is just pretty much just going to be getting the same thing, okay? So again, very much a discussion of the fundamentals. I'm going to be talking about movement down to like its tiny nitty gritty type of thing. And then we're going to be moving into more advanced concepts like taking fights and the sort, okay? So the first few things that I want to talk about is just understanding movement as a whole, okay? So what better way to start understanding it than by looking at some clips? I need you guys to kind of look at what exactly it is that they're doing that you might not be, okay? Doesn't take that much to find these clips. Literally just look up, Valorant clips and all of these will show up, okay? And the idea is simple. When you're looking at the way that these guys are moving, all right, I forgot that you like to do this when I'm recording. It's always like this, man. Yeah, I knew my PC was not going to handle this. Okay, instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you. And it actually overloaded itself. Classic. Okay. Do you guys see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. One of the things that you're going to notice about these clips and movement is understanding how they use their A and D keys. Okay. As these guys move around, I want to be discussing those speeds in just a little bit. But when you look at those clips, you're going to understand that they have one thing, and that's flow. If you're ever finding yourself struggling and taking any fights, it is because there's a disruption in the flow in which you're moving from one place to the next. I'm going to be showing you guys some diagrams that you guys can use to sort of relate in your own games. But a good way to kind of understand how people move that you might not be is understanding that they're peaking with A and D. Okay? When you're peaking with A and D, it is far stronger than moving with W and D or W and A. Okay? This is just as fundamental as it comes, but the problem with a lot of players is that they don't seem to understand the distance that they're using to find that opponent or really find that sort of fight that might give them an advantage. If anything, sometimes they think that they're holding an angle, but they're holding it wrong, and then someone swings them and they feel like they're getting one tapped, and they don't find any sort of reasoning as to why they're losing their fights. Okay, so with that out of the way, we're going to talk about the first few things, and that's understanding that whole feeling of flow, okay? Understanding why movement is as it is, understanding why movement hits the way it does, and the reason that movement is very important in Valorant, okay? So first, let's talk about these diagrams, okay? So in order for you to understand movement, you need to understand perspectives, okay? We're gonna do a little bit of a recap on previous classes, but in case you missed it, distance is pretty much, it goes toe-to-toe with movement in Valorant, because of how you can use it to get an advantage on an opponent. Okay, so let's say you are player A, okay, and player B is playing way closer to the wall. If you notice from this example, if the player is swinging the opponent, or at least they're swinging B, they're gonna have a greater chance of catching part of the opponent before they can catch them, okay? This can go in many ways. Let's say someone is holding a really off angle off on you, okay? Or maybe they're holding one of these like really weird 90s, okay? When you are playing towards an opponent like this, most of the times I see players thinking that all they can need to do is swing them, and that's all it takes, okay? It is more than just swinging. It is more than just pressing A and D when you're accounting for distances. What you need to make sure that you look into is how far you are from the wall that you're playing with, okay? So a good example, okay, is if you're looking at an opponent and you guys are both equal distances away, one way that you can get an edge is simply by either A, moving farther away, so as you're moving away from the angle, you can catch a little bit of the opponent as you're farther away, okay? Of course, there are some problems with this idea all the time. Let's say that you're trying to find an opponent and you're trying to hug the wall as you're swinging the opponent that's right here, right? Then you're gonna start hitting the wall, right? So we have problem number one. Make sure that you're paying attention to your surroundings, okay? When you're paying attention to your surroundings, it may come across as you trying to get this angle advantage on the enemy, but in reality, you're slowing down because you're hitting the wall, okay? Perspective comes in a lot of different ways in which that you can look at how you're holding an angle, or maybe you can look at something more in depth in abusing players that might be holding these really tight corners, but in reality, you're just able to abuse the perspective of being able to look at them before they can see you, okay? Does anyone have any questions on this concept? The concept of being able to use distances away from the wall, being able to use perspectives to catch someone off guard, or rather see them before they can see you. Any questions on that?
No.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so just to really recap, we discussed that distances come into play when you're looking at perspectives. Okay, and the farther you are away from the wall, the slower you can take your time to sort of catch the enemy, and then you can take your time with the swing. Now let's incorporate this into movement. Okay, movement has a lot of different ways of kind of working its way into a fight, but let's understand it just from the very, very nitty gritty. If you're looking at opponents straight in front of you, okay, if you're just looking them straight ahead, their movement is going to be at its fastest, okay? So if two opponents are looking at each other and just they're looking at each other right face to face, their movements are going to appear at their fastest. This is what I mean by perspectives. Not only have we found that perspectives can catch enemies off guard by being able to catch them from the side and maybe kind of get that information, but they also affect how fast they are perceived in front of your screen, okay? The same can be said about when they're coming in diagonally, like you can see right here. If they're coming in diagonally, you can see that they're going to look much slower as they're taking much more time to reach that line, right? This appears faster, this appears slower, okay? Last but not least, movement has a little bit of a ramp up, okay? So let's say, for example, you are playing the game and someone tags you, okay? Maybe they shot you in the leg or maybe somewhere in the shoulder, okay? Tagging is really important in Valorant because it slows you down. Sometimes it can even slow you down to a crawl. And what happens is you need to regain that movement speed back, okay? So when you're looking at movement, there's this little yellow line that I drew in there, which accounts for that ramp up time. Which is why when you're playing the game and maybe you're trying to play around cover and you're trying to swing, you may seem really slow to the opponent because you haven't really crossed this ramp up time, okay? So looking at this line right here, a good way to optimize every single fight that we take is by looking at how we can find ourselves looking straight ahead to the opponent, okay? So let's say we're finding our fight right here at this corner, right? If we were playing anywhere else and we were moving at different distances, we might look like that red line right here. And in fact, I'll just make a red line just so you guys can kind of picture it better. Okay. If I were moving like the red line, I'd be using something like W and A, for example, in this scenario. And I'd be moving diagonally and I would look much slower to the opponent that's playing right here. Okay. If we're using that same logic, we would want to be able to find a position that comfortably finds us in this little position right here. Maybe it's a T, maybe it's an I, whatever it is that, you know, fits your fancy, but you want to make sure that you're finding this optimal spot in a lot of your angles, okay? The problem is, how do you find that optimal angle? Where exactly do you look for it? And this is where slicing the pie comes into all of this, okay? It is how we can optimize our speed. It is how we can optimize the gunfights that we take. It is how we can account for those distances and those perspectives, okay? So let's say, for example, you are this green dot right here. You are green. You do not know where the enemy is. We do, of course, because of this little X that we have right there, right? But in order for us to figure out exactly where X is, we can't just move in and just try to find them. You're going to see how this movement can take a lot of different lines. And this movement right here is where a lot of players fail to take their fights accordingly. It is where you find that separation between someone that's in Ascendant to someone that is in Radiant, okay? It is the way that they position themselves. I will give you guys a little bit of a little, you know, checklist that you guys can use for later. But for now, let's just kind of cover across like the basics of slicing the pie. Slicing the pie is pretty much, as you can see over here in the diagram, it is cutting up each angle, each point of view, each sight line into slices. You want to make sure that you're breaking it apart as evenly as possible so it's easier for you to take the fight. So let's say, for example, you're looking into this angle right here and you do not know what's happening in this question mark right there. A good way for you to slice the pie is for you to, instead of going in and swinging this entire square, you break it up. And you break it up into tiny pieces. It is basically just taking a huge angle and basically making it into easily more attainable spots. So let's say I decide to swing short right here. I can now deal with this area right there. Okay, I swing a little bit more. I can now deal with this area right there. I swing a little bit more. I can now deal with this area right there. Notice how I'm slowly slicing the pie, and that is giving me the advantage of being able to take on the opponent by basically trying to cut as many angles that the enemy might be standing in. Does that make sense to you guys? Or should I cut it into a bit more deep with maybe a demonstration in the game? Would you guys prefer that?
I think it looks pretty good. I understood it.
Yes,
Okay.
I don't really.
Okay. Let's see. I do know that I could probably switch over, hopefully. Let's see. Does that switch into Valorant? I hope it does.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh my god, I almost jumped into a game. That would have been embarrassing. Okay. So when you're looking directly into slicing the pie, again, just to recap, we're making sure that we're slowly taking pieces away from that angle so we're not jumping directly into, multiple fights. Okay. This is why slicing the pie is the best. And when you see pros do it, and when you see any pros potentially taking multiple fights, this is exactly how they're isolating them. Okay. So point number 1, let's talk about that speed. Okay. This is something that I wanted to demonstrate, and then I'm going to show slicing the pie. You're going to notice that when I'm looking directly ahead, perspective wise, they're looking pretty fast. I'm pretty sure that unless you have really good control of your mouse and you feel really confident with your sensitivity, you can easily track these guys. Maybe they seem really hard to hit. Okay, whatever it is. Notice how as I slowly move away and I start again showing that diagonal speed, they start moving a lot slower. Notice how perspective wise, they're actually moving much slower in my screen. And this is much easier for me to hit than it is straight ahead. If I were to be taking a fight, and let's say I was taking a fight, I'm going to just use Sage here as a representation of an angle that we might be able to find here. Okay. If I was swinging this guy and we were looking straight ahead, I would look very fast on their screen. This is an abuse of that I technique or the T technique or whatever you guys want to call it. But what you guys want to use is essentially being able to look at them straight ahead. A good way for the enemy to try to avoid this situation is by putting themselves in scenarios like off angles, but more on that for another lesson. Right now, what I want you guys to identify is exactly where they're looking at in front and how you can abuse that perspective to look as fast as possible on their screen. Okay? Mistakes like that would be, mistakes that you could make, and these are very common mistakes that you might make while you're playing the game, okay, is instead of moving left or right, like I showed you, again, like the eyes, they're moving left and right, you're moving left or right, you're moving like this. This looks much slower on their screen. Instead of moving from perhaps this spray to where I'm standing, this position right here looks much slower on their screen, and it makes it really easy for them to just be able to line up the perfect shot. Okay, second point. I did cover a little bit of perspectives, but I really wanted to show this just a little bit more. You're going to notice that the farther I get from the enemy, you're going to notice that I can show a little bit of their shoulder. Okay. However, the closer I get to that same position, you're going to notice that I can't see any of them, but they can probably see me. And that is the same example that I was just showing with the lines kind of showing a little bit of the side of the circle. Okay. So that is perspectives. Last but not least, let's talk a little bit about slicing the pie. One way that you guys can practice slicing the pie, actually, there's a lot of ways that you guys can practice slicing the pie. The best ways that I've found that players tend to practice slicing the pie is by using Sage. What they tend to do is they just put a wall in the middle, and basically what they try to do is, again, they just try to slice the pie by moving in and out. Okay? By moving in and out, you're basically practicing the motion of covering the pie. I'm going to show you guys a little bit more on crosshair placement in just a second. But if you guys want to practice just now, you can jump into the range. You can put a Sage wall right in the middle, and you can practice by moving in and out. And this will give you a good idea of how you can start breaking these angles into tiny little pieces. If you feel like that's too easy and you want to take it into a more routine-based example, you can just put 100 bots, have them move. And what you can do is you can start from one of these angles. And what you can do is, because you don't know where the enemy is, you can start trying to move in and out. And as you look for the enemy, you can try to land on the opponent. Okay. This is a good example of, a good practice that you can take, that you can use to warm up if you don't feel very confident in your movement, right? Let's say I found them and then I can just kind of go in. And then if you're warmed up, you can take the shot, of course. But that's one example of how you can use that. I found that other players like to get different angles. So they like to use something like this, where they're basically moving in back and forth with something like this, where they can try their left and their right. And I found that other players like to use that angle over there, where they're just practicing using this area right here, because it gives them a little guide. One thing you're going to notice is that you can actually see the opponent through here. So if it gives you a little bit of a guide if you want to practice putting it into perspective. Yep. So that is the first thing. That is the basic concept of speed, okay, angles, and slicing the pie. Okay. Let's talk a little bit more about slightly tougher examples. Okay. Let me see if I can switch over, change windows. Perfect. Okay. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about the pathing aspect of finding an angle, because what I'm finding that players tend to know is they know that idea of counter strafing and they know that they need to swing an opponent, right? But then the problem then becomes, how do I take a fight? How do I prepare for that fight? How do I expect that fight from coming in? Okay. In order for you to be able to master movement, you need to understand that you can't do everything at once. You need to make sure that you're preparing it ahead of time. Okay. And a lot of movement is preparation based. A lot of movement is about making an expectation of what fight you want to take. And then from there, you kind of take it. Okay. This is why you see in a lot of those like high level clips, you see that some of the times it doesn't even feel like they even knew they were there. They're just taking that precaution that they might be there, or maybe they're pre-aiming, or maybe they are pre-firing. Okay. And these are things that really do help in taking those fights. Okay. So let's say, using this example, that you want to go from A to B. Okay. In order for you to move in, you might just kind of start taking this angle and you're trying to find this line. Oh, that's what's happening. You're trying to basically cross to this position, as quickly as possible. Some players like to just kind of make a more geometric shape when they're getting there. I find that some players maybe like to hug the outside of the wall as they come in. Some players like to take the fastest route, which is something like this. Okay. Depending on what you're doing, okay, it is important to note that you can't just kind of go to point A to point B when you know the enemies are nearby. Okay. So let's say there's an enemy right here, or maybe there's an enemy right here. How do you prepare for something like this? Okay. By using slicing the pie, you can prepare for opponents. Okay. And you should be preparing for the closest opponent each time. So let's say you are the green dot right here. What you would do is you would prepare yourself to swing this guy first, and then you would go back in. And then what you would do is then you would prepare for this guy. So you swing out, and then you swing for this guy, and then you go back in. Okay. So remember, you have to make sure that you establish the position that you want to fight. And then from there, you can prepare. Okay. A good way for you to prepare is something that's commonly taught in a lot of tactical games. Most importantly, that of CSGO. Okay. CSGO actually has a thing where they teach you how to properly take fights. Okay. And I'm about to teach you that right now. So one thing that I was showing when I was taking these fights, you might have noticed that I wasn't cutting directly into the line and I wasn't moving like this. I wasn't tracking around the corner. That was actually not my intention. Okay. What a lot of players tend to do is they actually like to prepare their crosshair into the wall when they're taking the fight. Okay. A good thing that you guys can practice when you're using this little technique that I just showed right here is practicing essentially getting the crosshair directly into the wall. So when you swing, you land where you want to fight. Okay. You guys can practice this in a million different ways. Okay. You guys can practice with something like using the wall here. Okay. And just having everybody up. And then what you can do is just kind of swing in and see if you land. Of course, I would rather you guys not have strafing bots because you need to practice landing on your opponent. But then once you get a little bit better, you can start kind of finding the opponent as you move back as you move back and forth. Okay. It is important for you guys to be able to kind of detail the idea of The enemy's going to be around this area, so I'm going to prepare ahead of time and swing him by jiggling him. Okay, so a good example is right here, right? Notice how I'm landing right on the opponent. You guys can practice by shooting. Maybe you guys want to practice by just landing your crosshair on them, whichever way fits you best. But I do encourage you guys to practice the idea as much as possible, because I find that a lot of players tend to just kind of swing out and then start spraying and hoping for the best. Make sure that you're pre-aiming and you're trying to find the opponent as fast as possible. Oh, someone send in a chat. It's my tab. Oh, the tab didn't work out. I appreciate that. My PC is by no means the best, so I do appreciate the heads up. Oh no, it's not sending it. I see. I'm gonna make a new stream here. Does this work? Is this better? Can you guys see the stream a little bit better?
It's really low quality.
Yeah, it's gonna be 1080 until I get my new PC coming in. Sorry guys.
Okay.
Hopefully for now it can suffice. The idea that I'm trying to kind of put in is simply when you're trying to track your opponent, make sure you're looking directly into the wall and you're swinging out. As long as you can see this motion of movement, then that's pretty much enough. Okay. But for now, yeah, it's gonna be blurry for now. Sorry guys.
No, you're good.
Okay. So for now, it is important for you guys to be able to detail this idea of being able to move directly into the wall and preparing your crosshair towards the opponent. Okay. Okay. So with that idea out of the way, let's talk a little about another concept that you guys need to use. Okay. Some of the last few concepts here that I need to cover are going to be much easier. Okay, so as you can see, we've established the fight that we want to take. Okay, we've prepared what fight we want to obviously kind of like apply in. Obviously, we want to make sure that we're moving directly in that eye like we've shown. And we want to make sure that we're preparing the crosshair into the wall when we're swinging out. Okay, but not everything goes according to plan. Okay, there's a couple things that you guys can use to sort of practice this idea. Okay. So let's say you're swinging and somebody peeks you during the time that you're kind of swinging. So your crosshair's not it's not directly into like the crosshairs. Sorry, the crosshair is not in the person's head. Okay. So let's say that's one of the problems that you're kind of going in. Or maybe you've been slicing the pie and then someone out of nowhere swings. Or maybe you're slicing the pie and you overswung. Okay. How do you prepare for these fights? Okay. There's a couple of things that players tend to make mistakes on when it comes to movement. They think that faster is better. They think that they need to have better mechanics. Sometimes they think that it's better for them to be able to micro adjust the most. Okay. There's a couple of things that we need to kind of discuss. The first one is to not insta crouch. If your crosshair does not land directly on their head and you were planning ahead of time to be able to kind of deal with this opponent, but they moved up and they surprised you. Okay. The last thing you want to do is sit down and basically let the opponent instantly tap you. Okay? I find that some players find it easier to just unbind crouch if that is something that they struggle with. I recommend that your best bet is to just jump into a death match, okay, and just get tapped. I'm being serious. Sometimes just jumping into like a death match and just getting shot a bunch of times teaches you how much time you actually have to move, to actually correct your crosshair into their head, to prepare for a fight. All of those things really come in handy. I've actually found that in higher elos, sometimes they'll get jumped, and instead of just trying to flick into the opponent, which they can do, I'm sure they have the mechanics to do that. Okay, what they do is they actually go back into cover, and sometimes they even run and gun as they're running back into cover. They're not trying to get the shot. They're not trying to get the fight when they are not ready for it. Okay, and this is why you see those clips of people just running and gunning sometimes, because they're just not trying to take that fight. They just got lucky. Okay, don't insta crouch. The more you can move, the easier it is. The easier it's going to be for you at the very least to take those fights. Okay. The second one is dancing. Okay, dancing is something that we apply, in Valorant. Is something that we've talked about here in Training Grounds, and the concept is simple. when you're looking at an opponent, okay, sometimes what you guys are both going to do is going to start moving back and forth. Okay. And this is kind of the concept of dancing. You're moving left, you're moving right, they're moving to the right, you're moving left. Okay. You're both are going to be moving back and forth. Okay. And the idea simply is the more you move, the harder it is for them to hit you. Okay. And that is true. Okay. You want to make sure that you're not standing still. But I've found that some players tend to move way too much. They think that the more they move, the better it is for them. And this is where this rule comes in. If you're going to be dancing, less is more. Okay. I find that players that try to use like movement to their advantage, they kind of do not account for a couple of things. Number one, when you move left or right, your crosshair moves with you. Okay. And the second thing is when you move, you also have to account for what your mouse is doing. So let's say this green brush right here is where I'm moving my mouse, and this red right here is where I'm moving with my keys. Okay. You're going to notice that these two are going to cancel out. This is an example of how movement and aim kind of tend to work with one another. So what I found is to have the best success in winning those fights where you're not ready. Okay. And let's say you can't get back into cover and you've been dancing. Sometimes you need to do one or the other. From the best players that I've seen, okay, I've found that sometimes they just keep their crosshair and they move it for very little. Okay. So again, they might be doing something like maybe with their mouse, they might do tiny little movements. They're not actually trying to move all that much and try to be like, trying to catch them. Instead, they're just moving very little and they're letting their movement actually do most of their work. And sometimes vice versa. Sometimes I've noticed that they do tiny little jitter steps. They're moving, then maybe they're tapping D, they're not actually holding it. Maybe they're just doing AD, right? They're not really moving all that much, right? But they're moving their mouse a lot. And that is the second thing, okay? So make sure that you're paying attention to how much you're moving either or, because it does impact how you take that fight, okay? And last but not least, raw mechanics, okay? Sometimes you do want to take that fight like I just showed just here, where, oh, it's not prepared for me, but I can still flick there, okay? If you like to use aim labs, there's one called Valorant Small Flicks. And I think that if you use Kovacs, I think it's called the same thing. I suggest that you look it up. It's pretty easy if someone just want to write it in chat or something like that. Valorant Small Flicks for both aim labs and Kovacs. Aim labs is free. So if you guys want to try that one, it is very easy to kind of practice. You're going to be practicing those motions of basically trying to hit an opponent around this range. Okay. So if you have a really hard time hitting those shots, make sure you're practicing this. Okay. So last few things to kind of cover. So let's talk about this part right here. Oh my God, it's such a disaster. I'll make a new little square right here. Let me give you some tips in case you are trying to get better at movement and you need to kind of like strengthen your journey. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what you can do. Okay. The first thing is make sure you're jiggling back and forth. If you remember, there's a little bit of a movement curve. Okay. You might start slow, but then it peaks up pretty quickly. Okay. It peaks about, maybe half a second, maybe less than half a second. Okay. But you are going to feel it. When you're moving back and forth, make sure you're taking longer jiggles rather than shorter ones. And the reason for that is when you're jiggling back and forth and you're not taking your time and you're moving very slowly, you're going to appear like you're not moving at all on the enemy screen. Pay attention to how much you're jiggling. Make sure you're paying attention to how much you're taking your time in taking those swings. Because even if you have this little T right here, maybe you have this eye all set up and whatnot, you're still going to be moving in that yellow that I showed earlier. You're still going to be moving, ooh, wrong one. You're still going to be moving right here where this box is. You're not going to be appearing any faster, okay? Make sure you're using that speed to your advantage, okay? And the second thing that I wanted to cover is simply pay attention to how you are overswinging, okay? I'd rather you guys learn to practice maybe in the range, maybe in a deathmatch. Try to practice swinging tiny little bits, tiny little pieces rather than taking way too much. A good way for you to practice is, again, team deathmatch. You're always going to have a fight in front of you. So you're always welcome to try to find ways to pre-aim and pre-fire the opponent. Okay. Are there any questions that you guys may have or something that you guys want me to demonstrate again?
I don't have a question, but I have a quick tip. When you go into deathmatch, you should bind your W to your melee. So you
W
can
to
only
your
use
melee?
this. Bind your W to the melee button.
Why is that?
Just it just gives me at least a habit of just using only A and D to peek, and not my W because I'll just have my knife out.
I see. Well, here's the thing though. I do see where the tip is going. It's very similar to unbinding your key. I would say refrain from doing so because what we're going to be talking about in the next section is going to be talking about pathing. Okay. And when you're pathing, you got to understand that sometimes there's safe sprinting and sometimes there's unsafe sprinting. Okay. And a good way to understand that is when you're looking at your character. Okay. When you're looking at your character, there's a ring in the minimap and you can see right outside the rings when people can hear you or not. Okay. And sometimes you might be in the ring where they can still hear you. So you got to make sure that your rifle is out during those times. So while it is good to practice, I would say maybe practice it when you're doing deathmatch. Maybe that's where you meant it. But if you're doing it in the game, I would encourage you to not do that because there will be times where you need to actually move forward and sprint quickly, but you need your gun out. Okay. So it is important to kind of mention those things. And yeah, that's kind of something that I wish I had time for. But that's pretty much one of the big things that I wanted to cover. Okay. So I've shown you some warm-ups that you guys can try in the range. I've shown you some examples of slicing the pie. I've shown you why it is good to keep your speed optimally. And I've shown you where it is best to keep your speed optimal at, right? Make sure you're finding that angle that someone's going to fight, right? So someone is going to be taking the fight with me right here. Then you can pretty much just predict that line if they're in front of you. Okay. Do I have any questions or anything of the sort? We're going to be jumping right into practice. So if you want to stick around and just jump into the range, share your screen, I'm going to give you a chance to kind of practice in the range and I can see how your movement is doing. Okay. After that, if you're feeling like your sensitivity is not doing too well, maybe I can help you with that. Sometimes I feel like I shouldn't be changing it. Okay. It's just a matter of movement. Okay. Maybe you'll jump into a deathmatch or a team deathmatch. You guys can do it in buddies or in pairs if you wish, but that's another thing. It's just in case you want to. Do I have any last few questions before I close the class?
I had a question.
Yes.
So what if you're trying to slice the pie in an area where you can get shot at from each side, kind of like a corridor, like on Ascent on A site,
Ascent on A site. Are we talking
like
about?
coming from?
Is it the one where the orb is right here? Am I?
No, it's like near CT spawn.
It's CT spawn A site.
Like, what if you can get shot from each side? How should you peek that?
Oh, you're talking about CT. Okay. Okay. So when
Like
you're
how you would
talking about,
enter from
so in
CT.
those angles right there, okay, in those angles, what you want to make sure that you're doing and you're paying attention to. I think I got it right. There we go. So the way that you want to make sure you're doing this. I believe it's like this, right? There's a little entrance here, and then this is A side, and then this is like B side over there. When you're going into an angle, right, then you want to make sure that you're taking the fight as safe as possible. You have to keep the context of what is already cleared. Okay. Of course, there's instances where the enemy could be both left and right. And that's where we have to just take a chance. Okay. It is a coin flip. Sometimes they might be on the right. Sometimes they might be on the left when you have to take those fights. Some of them are just not possible to take. Okay. Sometimes you have to just clear and take your time when you're clearing one area. Of course, however, that is the easiest answer to give because sometimes you just only have time for one. But if you're able to take your time, if you're able to slowly clear those angles and you're slowly able to kind of like clear one and then the other, my encouragement, it would be to find discrepancies in the walls. So a good example of this is bind. If you've ever gone towards hookah, you've noticed that when you go into hookah, okay, there's a slight discrepancy where if you cut a line right between one of them, one is longer than the other, or at least it appears to be longer than the other. And what you can do when you're slicing the pie is you can pick obviously the longer side first, and you can clear that one slicing the pie without being exposed to everybody over here in the red box. Okay. And then what you do is you come back as green, and then you do it all over again, and then you clear the red box. Okay. So a good example is basically you clear one angle, then you go back, and then you clear the other in case you're alone. Of course, you shouldn't be slicing the pie if you're not really safe, of course, if you're still practicing. But I do encourage you to take your time, clear one, go back, and then clear the other, okay? While still slicing the pie, because you'll still be going here, clear. Does that help by any chance?
Yes, it does.
Okay,
Thank you.
perfect. Do I have
So
any
the
last
best
few
solution
questions?
there would be to do it with another person.
Yeah, and the ideal scenario is you clear one and then someone clears the other, of course. But let's say you're alone. What I've found best is that players tend to just pick the longer side first. They clear, and then they go back, and then they clear over there, right? Because this area is now clear, and they had cover
Yeah.
from previous. Okay. Yeah, it's a little bit more advanced, but I do agree that it's a concept that will be covered maybe later if I do find students in the scrim struggling with it. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, so that was slicing the pie. That was movement. Hopefully you guys learned about why players tend to just look really fast on your screen. Maybe why you're getting tapped. Maybe why you're not really swinging into good positions. Make sure to practice good crosshair placement. Okay, one last tip that I'm going to give you guys before I close up. Look at the boxes. Sometimes you can see that some players line up directly with the boxes. So just keep your crosshair and just kind of move horizontally. At least your mouse, move it horizontally so you can keep good crosshair placement. Okay, that's enough for that. Let's close it up here. I'm going to open up the workshop, jump into the range, jump into the game, update it if you haven't played already. And I'm going to be looking at you guys and seeing how you guys play. Okay, hopefully you guys can show me that, you know, you've kind of like grasped the concepts, and moving forward, we can kind of use that in our scrims. Okay. All right, I'm going to close it up.